Break! Break! Light 'em up! Watch those clouds,
Hi,
Ben.
I'm
Could
Caliban.
be anthrax.
Generals has always been a bit of a mystery to me, and its release raised more questions than it answered. As a C&C game, it was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, and it contained everything we loved but also forgot to include some of the things that were dear to us. So, request some new shoes, preserve some freedom, and make China grow larger, as it's time to talk about the fantastic oddity that is Command & Conquer Generals. Generals is an RTS released by EA in 2003 and is probably one of my favourite games in the genre. It had a modern setting and featured three asymmetrical factions, the USA, China and the Global Liberation Army, or GLA. Unlike previous C&C titles, these three factions were very unlike each other and would play out very differently. The USA is high-tech and has advanced and powerful weapons like stealth bombers, drones and tanks with active missile defences. China has brute force, relying on heavy armour and artillery to control the battlefield. Where the USA would send a helicopter to gather resources, China would send a number of trucks. Where China would attack from afar with a nuke cannon, the USA would use a cruise missile. Into this mix would step the GLA with its network of underground tunnels, scud launchers and angry mobs armed with AK-47s. Generals features three separate campaigns that actually follow a chronological order. Rather than picking a side and trying to win the same game as you did with the Tiberium series or with Red Alert, the Generals campaigns are all designed to be played one after another. The China campaign shows the rise of the GLA and China's response, followed by the GLA campaign that shows the rebuilding of the GLA and their future successes and their eventual acquisition of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The story is then concluded with the USA campaign, where the USA joins the fight in earnest, pushes the GLA back, removes their capabilities and restores some semblance of peace to the world. From a gameplay perspective, I think Generals is probably the finest entry in the entire franchise. It's modern, smooth and responsive. You get to play with a lot of different units. These units have a purpose and there are a great number of interesting interactions between them. The factions have a very distinct feel and these differences give the game a lot of replayability. Everything is flavoured with a big spoonful of parody, which does give the game some humour, and thematically it's very Team America World Police in how it treats its subject matter. The multiplayer was a lot of fun, and back in the day I would play countless hours of it with my friends. It also had an expansion pack called 0 Hour that made the game even better. This consisted of 9 different generals you could play, which each had a different tech tree and were suited to different playstyles. One was more suited to rushing, one was more suited to turtling, you get the picture. Now that you know what Generals is, let's talk about the Command & Conquer universe and where it fits in. The Command & Conquer games are connected in some way, although the links aren't really that satisfying. This is by accident rather than by design, and in my opinion there are two clear reasons for that. Firstly, there was never a grand plan in place. There was no detailed and carefully crafted timeline and things just landed as they fell. Secondly, when EA wrapped up Westwood Studios in 2003 and took over running of the franchise themselves, any thoughts of continuity seem to have been forgotten, with the second and third Red Alert games abandoning any links to the Tiberium series. I have seen several attempts to try and link everything together. There are plenty of fan theories on the internet, and some of the ex-Westwood staff have chipped in with their own opinions based on what they were planning to do with the games before the studio was closed. However, most of these revolve around time travel, with the events of each game occurring on a different alternative timeline. Without spending ages trying to research, unpack and tie up all these possibilities, I think it's reasonably safe to state the following. The 4 Command & Conquer games in the Tiberium saga all take place in the same timeline and are generally thought to be direct sequels to a victorious GDI campaign ending. Renegade, the shooty game in the series, also fits into this story and takes place somewhere in and around the events of the first game. Red Alert is a prequel to these games and establishes that it is an alternate reality to ours that diverged when Einstein went back in time and killed Hitler. Red Alert 2 and Red Alert 3 are unrelated to the events of the first Red Alert and each other, but they are probably divergences of the same timeline in which Hitler was removed before he could take power. There are plenty of holes and contradictions in even this simplest of explanations, and in truth, there is no one canonical version of the story that is anything close to satisfactory. There are people that claim otherwise, and those people are entitled to their own opinions, but at the end of the day, that's all they are, opinions. So, let's pull back from the in-game story and instead look at the release of these titles, focusing just on the main PC releases and their expansions. Firstly, in 1995 we had Tiberium Dawn. This is a retroactive title, but one I'm happy to use to avoid confusion, but just for clarification, it was originally just called Command & Conquer. The following year saw the release of an expansion called the Covert Operations, which didn't develop the story at all but did include an extra 15 standalone missions. Later, in 1996, Red Alert was released, followed by its 2 expansion packs, Counter-Strike and Aftermath. These did include new missions and some new units too, but like Covert Ops, there was no additional story or cutscenes, although FMV cutscenes were added at a later date when both expansions were bundled together and released for the PlayStation, under the name Red Alert Retaliation. It is around this time that Westwood Studios is bought by EA, however at this point they are still very much doing their own thing without too much in the way of interference from their new parent company. 1999 saw the release of the first proper sequel, Tiberium Sun, and then its expansion, Firestorm, the following year. From this point on, the expansions were more fully fleshed out additions to the game that spawned them, including additional story and FMV instead of just missions, units and maps. Following the Tiberium Sun games, we would see Red Alert 2 in the year 2000 and then Yuri's Revenge in 2001. The next game in the franchise would be Renegade, arriving in 2002. Unfortunately, this was not a popular release and, along with Earth and Beyond, Westwood's unsuccessful MMO, it would cause EA to lose confidence in Westwood and close the studio. EA would then revive the Tiberium saga and the Red Alert series a few years later with Tiberium Wars in 2007 and then Kane's Wrath and Red Alert 3 the following year. This trend would continue in 2008 and 2009 with the release of Uprising, an expansion to Red Alert 3, and then Tiberium Twilight. There would be further attempts to try and keep both franchises alive in the years that followed, but these consisted of cheap cash grabs like mobile games. For some reason these failed, even though us guys had phones. Now, the astute among you might have noticed a bit of a gap on the timeline, and that's where our enigma fits in. You see, in 2003, EA would release Command & Conquer Generals, something that is a real curiosity on the timeline, both in and out of the game. From a universe perspective, the game took place on a totally different timeline from any other game, and seemed to follow the real world in almost every respect, all the way up to the modern era. The Second World War happened, as did the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, Operation Desert Storm and the terror attacks that followed. The main difference seems to be that all of the world's terrorist organisations banded together after this to form a global liberation army, which starts a Third World War with an attack on China in the game's opening mission. Outside of the game lore, there is just as much deviation. Generals looks vastly different from Tiberium Sun or Red Alert 2, with a 3D engine that isn't a million miles away from how Tiberium Wars would look 4 years later. The biggest and most notable difference is how the story is presented. There is no live action FMV and no CGI cutscenes. Briefings are a narrated voiceover and any demonstration of the story happens within the game engine itself. The other big difference is the tone. Gone is the hammy acting, cartoonish villains, time travel and alien incursions, and instead we're presented with something that is somewhat darker and more serious than we've ever seen in a Command & Conquer game before. The only reason that this isn't more immediately obvious is the lack of cultural sensitivity in some of the design choices that borders on parody to the extent that it masks the somewhat darker elements of the game. The previous games have weapons of mass destruction and a callous disregard for human life, but these are shown in the same way a Bond villain would explain their evil plan. Generals doesn't feel like this, and really leans into some of the unpleasant topics like suicide bombing, WMDs and collateral damage. But who actually created C&C Generals, as perhaps that would shed some light on this. It has a nice big EA logo on the front, but as usual things are a little more complicated than that. It was released on the 11th of February 2003, which was just weeks after Westwood and its subsidiaries were disbanded and the remains merged into EA Los Angeles. Although it's credited as being developed by EA Pacific, that particular subsidiary was previously known as Westwood Pacific, who had created Red Alert 2. For the most part, these were totally different teams than the other Westwood. You have to remember that there was no remote working back then, so if you had another office 5 hours away, then you would need a totally different team to staff it. However, they would share a very similar direction, and thankfully, a digital archival copy of a magazine called Next Generation allows us to fill in some blanks. A little bit more history. Even before the EA acquisition, Westwood wasn't actually an independent entity. From '92 onwards, it was a division of Virgin Games. When Virgin acquired Westwood, Brett Sperry, Westwood's co-founder, would go on to be Virgin's president of publishing, which would put him in charge of all 5 of Virgin's teams, one of which was Virgin's own Burst Studios. Burst were not doing so well, but it was restructured by Brett and turned into Westwood Pacific, and then later on, after the EA acquisition, it was rebranded as EA Pacific. I also checked the credits for Red Alert 2 and Generals, and there was a name or two in common with some of Westwood's older games. So, although EA Pacific might sound like a totally different entity than Westwood, it's clear that they were moulded and influenced a great deal by their previous parent. So, how does all this fit together and explain how Generals came to be? Well, unfortunately we'll never know for sure. I scoured the internet for old articles about the game and interviews with the developers. They talk about features and units, but never about the conception of the game and how it came to be. However, that wouldn't be a very satisfying conclusion to a video, so I do have some theories of my own. What follows is my own speculation based on what we've learnt so far. It's 2001. Westwood Pacific have recently completed work on Yuri's Revenge, the follow-up expansion to the very successful Red Alert 2. EA, their parent company, wants to make some more money and are keen to see a new Command & Conquer RTS enter production. Those games have always been very profitable and it's a huge IP, and as we all know, EA loves a safe bet. However, there's a problem. It's too soon for another Red Alert game. The expansion pack hasn't even hit the shelves yet, and if they oversaturate, they risk losing sales. There is another problem. Games in the Tiberium series are created by the main division of Westwood, and they are currently busy on 2 projects, Renegade and Earth and Beyond. This makes EA very nervous, as both of these titles are something a little different. They need a safe bet, so they go to Westwood Pacific and tell Mark Skaggs, the president, that they need a new Command & Conquer game that isn't a serial to Tiberium Sun or Red Alert. So what does Mark do? Well, I'm guessing he goes to his team and they start some initial planning and development. They know they'll need a new engine. Tiberium Sun and Red Alert 2 are already looking very dated, so they can start on that, but what to do thematically? I'm guessing they pick a modern setting. The memories of the Cold War in everyone's collective consciousness have faded somewhat and are being replaced by the images and videos of Desert Storm. Plus the Tiberium series has already investigated the near future, and StarCraft has the sci-fi angle well covered. They probably continued on for a while with a desert warfare setting in mind until September 11th, 2001 when the world changed forever. The traditional old enemies of the USSR are gone, and the new threat is now well organised terrorist groups with murderous dedication. If that wasn't enough, Black Hawk Down is released, and the visuals of AK and RPG armed militias taking out high-tech modern hardware make a permanent impression on anyone with access to a cinema. The writers and producers probably realise that people's perception of warfare has changed, and if they want to make something that resonates, then these themes are not ones that can be ignored. And off they would go. Armed with modern themes and a talented team of developers and artists, EA Pacific would go on to make one of the finest entries in the entire series. The hammy cutscenes of its predecessors probably felt out of place, so I'm not surprised they left those behind. I do remember missing their inclusion at the time, but now I understand why they thought they might not have been a good fit. I'm imagining what the mid-90s Westwood might have done if tasked for creating cinematics for the China and GLA campaigns. I've got a feeling that it might have made the game a little uncomfortable to replay in later years, not to mention affect its availability on the EA store for future converts to the series. Anyway, that's C&C Generals, a bit of a wild card that didn't really fit in with the rest of the Command & Conquer series, but was an excellent game nonetheless. Hi, I'm Caliban. Thanks for listening to my musings on Generals, a game that I truly love. Do you feel the same? Let me know in a comment. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button, and if you want some more then subscribe away.